This chapter will be on our first exam, and we should be able to finish all of this material this week. So it's chapter 17, the endocrine system. And the endocrine system works with our nervous system to allow us to establish homeostasis and to handle various environmental changes that we actually experience. We need the endocrine system because it's a very different system from the nervous system. The nervous system is great with control. It's really rapid, really quick and effective, but it fatigues. For example, if you were trying to hold a 30-pound weight out to your side, after about a minute, your arm would start to fatigue and you would actually not be able to hold it up so well anymore. In spite of different neurons firing to help you to actually keep that area up, the fatigue would happen. You'd run out of neurotransmitter, and as you know, your muscle cells would also fatigue as far as ATP generation to help them with contraction. So the nervous system is fatigable, right? What's neat about the endocrine system is its main product it puts out is called a hormone. And the hormone is dumped into the bloodstream. It circulates around to its target organs via the bloodstream, and it gets to its target cells, which obviously have receptors for that hormone, and then starts an internal cellular process that can last a long time. It's slow to start because the hormone has to be triggered to be released, and then it's released into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream it has to circulate to its target organ. But once it's got to its target organ, the cellular effects are actually pretty long lasting. And so with these two systems combined, we have an immediate thing that can take care of us, and then we have this long-standing thing, long-term, actually in the background, making sure our homeostasis is actually nicely in balance for us. The notes here may be a little bit different from what you have in front of you, but not a lot, because there was some redundancy and I actually just recently took them out. The organs that we are interested in with the endocrine system are the hypothalamus, the pituitary, which is also known as the hypophysis, the pineal gland, our thyroid gland, our parathyroid glands, the adrenal gland, and the thymus. There are some other organs that are also endocrine organs, but that's not the only thing they do. The pancreas, testes, and ovary. When we take a look at this list, one of the things that I want you to realize, the first three items on that list are not just endocrine organs, are they? Where have we seen them before? With the nervous system. So this is with the brain. So the hypothalamus has endocrine function, but it also is a predominantly nervous system area of the brain. The pituitary also is part of the brain, but it is mostly endocrine. And the pineal gland, also we talked about that, and that's part of the brain. And will function with some sleep-wake cycles for us. Now, the pancreas, testes, and ovary have endocrine features, but they do something else besides endocrine. When you think of endocrine from the pancreas, what is the hormone you guys think of as its insulin? So the pancreas is indeed responsible for releasing insulin, which helps with blood sugar control or blood glucose control, but it also produces another hormone called glucagon, which is also responsible for helping us to have good blood glucose control, and we'll talk about that when we get to the pancreas. Testes and ovary, testes produces testosterone, ovaries produces estrogen and progesterone, but what other things do the testes and ovaries produce? Eggs, sperm, gametes. If somebody didn't speak up, I was going to call your mothers in to have them have a sex talk with you guys. So, because even mothers know the answer to that question. And if you guys don't know, then we need some mothers in here talking to their kids. So our notes here, other organs have more than one role. So pancreas is endocrine and it's exocrine. Do you guys know what it's exocrine for, what system it's for? The stomach. Well, actually, the gastrointestinal system. It releases digestive enzymes into the small intestine. We'll learn about that. But the pancreas has an exocrine and an endocrine role. Exocrine excretes into a duct which delivers the products to a surface. Whether it's a lumen inside or when it's the surface of your skin, it's still a surface area via a duct system very often. So that's the pancreas. Endocrine, exocrine, endocrine, insulin and glucagon, exocrine digestive enzymes. Now that we've talked about the organs that we're going to look at, let's just talk about their product. So they produce a product. The product is called a hormone, and the hormone is released into the bloodstream to circulate via the bloodstream to get to the target organ. There are two main categories of hormones. One of them is amino acid based, and most of our hormones actually fall into this category. So most hormones are amino acid based. And another thing about this means that they are water soluble. And so this water solubility means that they can actually be easily transported in the bloodstream in the fluid portion of our blood, which is called our plasma. So water soluble, they can be dissolved in the plasma and transported to the target organs. Now when you hear amino acid base, what other material of our body is made up of amino acids? Proteins. So protein-based, amino acid-based, or even polypeptide, right? Because polypeptide is a couple of amino acids strung together to actually make a substance. And so hormones are amino acid-based also, not just long protein chains. Now, steroids are another category of our hormones, and so they are synthesized from that parent compound called cholesterol. And they're easily recognized by their ending. Do you guys remember the steroid-based, cholesterol-based hormone ending from first semester? Sterone. Do you guys remember sterone? So testosterone, progesterone, and we'll be talking about aldosterone. All of those sterone endings tells you from the name that they are actually steroid-based. And estrogen is also a steroid-based hormone. It just doesn't happen to end with sterone. So steroids indeed are lipid-soluble, correct? And this is important because if they're lipid-soluble, what are they? How do we carry them around in our bloodstream? It's easy to carry around amino acid-based ones because they're water soluble, but lipid soluble, that's not the predominant form of our plasma, right? It's going to be water. Most people actually do know that. It's water-based. And so this solubility requires them to have carrier proteins. So we have to have carrier proteins to help get them around via the blood. And they also exist as bound, which means they're bound to their carrier protein, or unbound, which means that they have disconnected from their carrier protein. And another term you'll hear is free, if they're unbound hormone. So this is all, when you see bound or unbound, that's referring to the carrier protein that's actually transporting them. The free is the only active one. You can't do anything if it's bound up. It has to be free in order to actually be able to do this, to actually work for you at the cellular level. Now, the carrier proteins also help to prevent degradation. And let's say breakdown. How about that? Let's use that term. So they prolong the longevity of the hormone in that bloodstream. The steroid-based hormones are from our gonads and the adrenal cortex. And gonads are testes or ovary. So it's the free form that actually gets into the cell to actually do its duty. There's a little area that's right after this that talks about how it's excreted and things like that are broken down it's repeated in this chapter, so make an X through the first stuff and we'll be getting to it in just a moment. Target cell specificity. Hormones circulate throughout the body, but only affect the cells that have receptors for them. So just like what we've talked about before, receptors are these transmembrane proteins that have an area on them on the outside that something binds to it and causes changes with that protein. So that's what we're talking about here. The hormones circulating around, and if it's estrogen and it comes across, say, a blood vessel, is it going to affect the blood vessel? No, it doesn't, because those sex steroid hormones are actually designed for certain target organs. Breast tissue, for example, uterine tissue also, and also the external genitalia. So it's going to have receptors on those organs that are specific for that hormone. So that's why we have this topic here, target cell specificity. Hormones can only react with cells that they were supposed to react with, and those cells will have receptors for that hormone. Now, this target cell, the receptors, are dynamic. What this means is that the receptors a cell has on its surface for that hormone can change. Dynamic means associated with change. And they'll change for various reasons. I want to ask you a question about hormone levels. Do you think all hormones are always at one level? No. So that's important. Hormone levels fluctuate. And also, glands can become non-functional or over-functional, correct? And so our cells, which have receptors on them for these various hormones, can change their receptor situation based upon whether or not it needs more hormone or doesn't need more hormone. And that's what upregulation and downregulation is actually all about. The cell can produce more receptors because the more receptors it has, the more sensitive it becomes. If you were having this condition called hypothyroidism, what does that mean to you? What does that term mean to you? You have a problem with your thyroid not putting out enough thyroid hormone, right? That's a very important metabolic hormone, and all of our cells have receptors for that hormone. So if you are hypothyroid and you're not putting out much hormone, your cells will do something to try and not feel that condition, and that is they will upregulate. They will make a whole bunch of receptors so that whatever little bit of thyroid hormone's out there, they can grab. And so that's an important aspect. Upregulation is seen whenever we have any sort of hormonal deficiency. This could also be seen with insulin-dependent diabetes. So people who have insulin-dependent diabetes, that means that they need insulin to actually correct their problem. So their insulin levels, before they got to zero, they were starting to drop. You guys follow that? So you don't go from normal insulin to zero insulin. There's always destruction of the cells that are producing insulin, so your insulin levels go down. And these people don't know that they're having dropping insulin levels because their cells are upregulating insulin receptors. And then they can upregulate all they want, right? But ultimately, there will not be enough insulin to make them function, and so then that individual then becomes symptomatic. So this is the body's way of saying, well, maybe this is just a temporary process, and it will self-correct, and then we're going to be fine. But that's only if it's a temporary process. If it's actually a disease process, this upregulation will ultimately fail in the aspect that you'll become symptomatic. Downregulation is the opposite of upregulation. So we have receptors going, wait a minute, I don't want to do all that stuff. Stop telling me to work so hard. Thyroid hormone tells your cells, ramp up your metabolism. Well, there's another condition that's the opposite of hypothyroidism. It's called hyperthyroidism. So these are great examples. Too much thyroid hormone, telling cells work, 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 work. It's like the master of the slave, cracking the whip, just like my little emoji, emoticon that I have emoji. Cracking the whip, work harder, work harder, work harder. And the cells go, no, 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 no. And so what they do is, just like kids, you know, they kind of stop listening to you, they down-regulate. So they decrease the number of hormone receptors on their surface so that they don't get told to do all of that stuff. So obviously this is very important when we have hormone excess. So upregulation with low levels of hormone, making therefore the cells more sensitive to what is there. Downregulation with too much hormone, taking the sensitivity levels down so the cells don't have to do the additional work that too much of a hormone level will do. And you can only downregulate to a certain amount, and then you'll become symptomatic after a while. So those are temporizing effects. You guys follow me with that? Upregulation and downregulation are not meant to be permanent things. They're meant to be temporary things. Hormones. A hormone can have all kinds of effects on a cell. So this list that we have here are just some effects that some hormones can do for us. So not all the cells do all of these things that we actually have listed below. Number one, alters membrane permeability to ions. We're going to learn how aldosterone will affect membrane permeability to sodium and potassium, for example. Stimulates protein synthesis. Actually, thyroid hormone tells cells to actually make more proteins within them. They're very important for neurotransmitter. So that would be an example of too much thyroid hormone, or thyroid hormone, what it does by stimulating protein synthesis, enzymes and collagen. Enzyme activity. Some of our hormones are going to activate or deactivate enzymes within that cell. Secretory activity increases the activity level of various glands. Prolactin, for example, will help with milk production for women and things along that line. And cell division, increase the rate of mitosis. Growth hormone is an example of that. So you're going to learn what our various hormones do, and you'll come back and make sure you know where they fit in this list of categories. Hormones will have their impact on a cell via either this second messenger system or direct gene activation. So they will actually tell a cell that here's the hormone, and the hormone's telling you what to do. Second messenger system is actually what we use when we are using amino acid-based hormones. What we actually have is the hormone is, so second messenger, the hormone is the first messenger. And it binds to a membrane receptor. When it binds to that membrane receptor, this binding activates G protein. G protein will then activate adenylate cyclase. So adenylate cyclase is an inactive enzyme. And we know that because of the ACE ending. Adenylate cyclase will then convert ATP into ADP. Excuse me. It does convert ATP to ADP, but the ultimate product is not ADP, it's cyclic AMP. Let's go to the end. Cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger. So that's why it's called a second messenger system. Hormone's the first messenger, cyclic AMP is the second messenger, and then in that cell, that's where cyclic AMP is, it's intracellular, it will activate various protein kinases, which will then activate or deactivate an intracellular enzyme. This is all dependent upon the cell. So you go, which one activates, which one inactivates? All you have to know, depending upon the cell, it will either activate or deactivate another enzyme within that cell. So that's what cyclic AMP will then do. This is called a cascade of events. Can you guys follow me with this? Just like this will cause this to happen, which will cause this to happen, which will cause this to happen, just like a cascading waterfall for you. So a cascade of events. That's our amino acid-based hormone mechanism. Direct gene activation is the other hormones method. So this is our steroid-based hormone, steroids. And that's because steroids are lipids. And what are our cell membranes made out of? Phospholipids. So, and also steroids actually are also embedded in part of that membrane. So this material can easily diffuse through our cell membranes. So steroid-based hormones easily diffuse through cell membranes. Once they're inside the cell, they bind to an intracellular receptor. And this creates this hormone receptor complex. This hormone receptor complex is then transported into the nucleus. And once it's in the nucleus, it attaches to DNA, activating a gene. That gene activation will have the cell do whatever it was that hormone was designed to have that cell do, for example. How do we control hormone levels? This is the part that was actually earlier, and I asked you to X that out because we were coming up to it. Well, the synthesis and release of our hormones is dependent upon what causes this, what stimulates that endocrine gland. So what's going to stimulate that endocrine gland to actually release that hormone? And hormone levels are under, what do you think, positive or negative feedback? Negative feedback, absolutely. Under ordinary circumstances, when you have enough thyroid hormone, that will suppress the other glands responsible for telling you to make more thyroid hormone. And so you have to understand, you're told to make thyroid hormone, you make a bunch of thyroid hormone, well, the teller has to stop telling you after you have enough thyroid hormone, and that's some negative feedback aspects. Makes you stop. Now, the nice thing, too, about this, and we're going to come down to this endocrine gland stimuli right down here in just a moment. The other thing that we're, well, let's go what stimulates the endocrine gland, and then we'll go into elimination. The thing that stimulates an endocrine gland to release its hormone are either hormonal, humoral, or neural. And what this means is that a hormone will tell an endocrine gland to release its hormone. A hormone from another gland, because if it's a hormone, it has to be from a gland, people. Hormones are always from glands. A hormone from another gland will tell another endocrine gland to release its hormone, and that's called hormonal. It's also called tropic. So you often will see the term tropic associated with this hormonal stimulus to release a hormone. You'll also sometimes see RH releasing hormone and IH inhibiting hormone with various endocrine glands. So a releasing hormone will tell an endocrine gland to release its desired hormone, for example, thyroid hormone, and an inhibiting hormone will tell it to actually stop. So tropic is the term that we need to always remember if it's a hormonal process. Humoral means a level of something in our body fluids is controlling the gland's release of that chemical. And for example, what about glucose? Is glucose a level of something in our body fluids? And when glucose levels go up, insulin's released. When glucose levels go down, insulin release stops. Glucagon will go up if it needs to. So glucose goes up, insulin release, glucose goes down, no more insulin release. That's humoral. Another chemical that can be in our body fluids that will actually affect the release of a hormone is potassium. If our potassium levels are high, so glucose up causes release of insulin. Potassium, if potassium is elevated, that causes our adrenal gland to release aldosterone. So high potassium levels are bad for us. The adrenal gland will release aldosterone, and aldosterone will put potassium in our urine. And that's the main stimulus for aldosterone release. Nervous system can cause a hormone release. And indeed, remember, a hormone is amino acid based or steroid based and dumped into the bloodstream and circulates around. Well, this is something that you typically have not thought of as a hormone, but epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are also considered hormones because the adrenal medulla releases them into the bloodstream whenever we're under fight-flight, correct? So that's a neural stimulation. Now, these, like epinephrine and norepinephrine, circulating around in your bloodstream, and it can't keep circulating around in your bloodstream forever. So what stops that elevated level or drops that elevated level down to normal? And that's where elimination comes from. Hormones can make it to the liver, and the liver can actually degrade it, break it apart, break it into its bits and pieces. Kidneys can actually excrete our hormones, and also whenever the hormone gets to the target cell, it can be taken up by that target cell, and that's another way to actually release those hormones. And that would be something like steroid-based hormones when it gets taken into the cell. So liver enzymatic degradation, kidneys pee it out, and then the cells eat it up, so to speak. Yes?
If we have something that is not being broken down, is that where your kidney stones come from then?
Kidney stones have nothing to do with this. So kidney stones are actually a blockage of the drainage system of the kidneys. Our little pictures here are just to reinforce a visual of the hormonal situation. Anterior pituitary releases a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone, which then is put into the bloodstream for its basic metabolic effects. Humoral stimulation is just like what we actually talked about. Blood glucose will stimulate pancreatic islets to release insulin. It will affect the blood glucose level, cause it to drop. But glucose has to increase first, so that's humoral. And then nervous system is that epinephrine, norepinephrine, which we commonly call adrenaline. The specific organs we're going to take a look at are as follows. The pituitary is our master gland, master endocrine gland. And that's because it controls so many endocrine functions and body functions. The pituitary gland has, if you were to draw a low power view of it, it has this kind of blob look to it. This stalk here is the infundibulum and is attached to the hypothalamus. And this stalk is important because it contains a bloodstream and it contains a neuronal connection. And this pituitary gland is actually subdivided into an anterior and posterior part. And the anterior portion is the adenohypophysis. And the posterior part is the neurohypophysis. Anterior pituitary, adenohypophysis, posterior pituitary, neurohypophysis. And that's because the anterior pituitary is glandular in appearance and has darkly staining cells of glandular nature. The posterior pituitary does not have that type of an appearance. It's paler in appearance typically and has a kind of a mixed up, I want to use the term stromal, but that's not very helpful for you. It's a very linear, lacy looking pattern. I think I prefer the word lacing. The hypothalamus has all kinds of releasing hormones that will regulate activity of our anterior pituitary. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone, and only two inhibitory hormones, prolactin inhibiting hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So there's only two hormones that we actually have inhibiting hormones for. We have a whole bunch of releasing hormones from the hypothalamus to our pituitary. The pituitary, the anterior portion, releases thyroid stimulating hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland to create thyroid hormone, which is abbreviated TH, which is then emptied into the bloodstream to then circulate to all of our cells. Also, the anterior lobe produces prolactin, which has a target organ of the mammary gland to help with milk production. The anterior pituitary also releases FSH and LH. Those both play an important role in formation of testosterone and formation of gametes, as well as formation of estrogen and progesterone for the woman. Also, the anterior pituitary releases ACTH. It's called adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that's why it's easier to say ACTH about that, and that's going to affect the adrenal cortex. Also, we have growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, and that will stimulate all kinds of activity in the liver, muscle, bone, adipose tissue. Let's take a look at the histology. You don't have this picture, but let's go ahead and take a look at the histology of the anterior lobe of the pituitary or the adenohypophysis. This is a special stain to actually show you acidophils and basophils. And that's the cell types that we find from our anterior pituitary. We have acidophils, we have basophils, and we have chromophobes. Phil means to love, and phobe means to hate or dislike. Acidophils take up an acid stain, basophils take up a basic stain, and chromophobes mean they don't like a stain. So they really don't want a stain. This picture here is perfect for distinguishing acidophils from basophils from chromophobes. Acidic stains are reddish. Basic stains are bluish, and chromophobes are pale. I see a chromophobe that's standing out right in the middle of this really well for me. Do you guys agree that that cell looks like a chromophobe to you? So let's do a little chromophobe line there. You'll be able to see this on the video. Let's see. Let's find a nice pinkish reddish stain. Well, I see them all over the place. Do you guys see it all over the place? I'm just going to go ahead and randomly choose, oh, I'm going to choose this guy. And so that's my acidophil example. And then the basophil looks kind of bluish or purplish. And I hope you can appreciate that guy there. Looks a bit on the bluish purplish side. So he's a basophil. There are others. I could say that guy there. I could say this guy here, or this guy here, or this one here. The red spot that you see in some of those basophils is actually the nucleus of that cell. It's actually acidic in its stain uptake. So I do want to actually point out why some of those might be a little confusing because you see a little bit of redness with them. This is the cytoplasm that we're talking about. Acidophils, basophils, and chromophobes. It's what the cytoplasm actually takes up. Now, the acidophils are responsible for producing what I call hormones with this abbreviation, GP, and I'm going to put A here for acidophil. So G is growth hormone, P is prolactin. Those are produced by acidophils. And then basophils are also going to produce what I call the B-flat story. So the B stands for basophils, and the F is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. L is luteinizing hormone, or LH. The A is ACTH, is what I prefer to say, and the T is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Chromophobes, none of those. Growth hormone. Growth hormone is designed for general body growth. Makes muscles bigger, bones bigger, everything bigger. Fat bigger too. Thyroid stimulating hormone is designed to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone, which is then released into the bloodstream when we demand it with thyroid stimulating hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, controls the release of adrenal cortex hormones. I'll say almost all adrenal cortex gonadotropins, those are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. They control the release of hormones from our gonads as well as the development of our gametes. Prolactin will stimulate milk production after childbirth. So those are the hormones of the anterior pituitary, GPA and B-flat. The posterior lobe, known as the neurohypophysis, what's important is the cell bodies are in the hypothalamus and the axonal endings are in the posterior pituitary. So cell bodies in hypothalamus, with axons in the infundibulum and axonal endings or terminals in posterior lobe. They are stored here. Hormone, which we would ordinarily think of as neurotransmitter, stored in axonal endings. And it isn't released until the hypothalamus says to release it. The two hormones from the posterior pituitary are ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And so antidiuretic means to what? Make more urine or less urine? Less urine. Diuresis means to pee. So antidiuretic hormone means we do not want to actually make more urine because we are probably dry, dehydrated. So that's an important aspect of antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is also in our posterior pituitary, and it is designed to actually stimulate contraction of smooth muscle in the uterus and the breast tissue. Oxytocin is one of the rare instances of positive feedback control. All the others are under negative feedback control. We had a picture up above that basically had that information. Now here's a flow chart just to reiterate that information. Hypothalamus has all of these releasing hormones. So remember, it's considered an endocrine organ as well as a neural organ. So corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing or inhibiting hormone, and prolactin releasing or inhibiting hormone. All of those act on the adenohypophysis, the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So these are all considered tropic because it's causing another gland to release hormones, correct? A tropic hormone causes another gland to release hormones, and the pituitary is considered an endocrine gland, and we're going to release hormones. CRH will cause the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which will act on the adrenal cortex and cause the adrenal cortex to make corticoids, steroid-based hormones. So is ACTH a tropic hormone? Is it causing a gland to release a hormone? Yes. Let's go over to TSH. TSH is called thyroid stimulating hormone. Anterior pituitary released it after thyrotropin releasing hormone told it to. And then TSH is going to act on the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Is TSH a tropic hormone? Yes. LH and FSH is going to work on the gonads to release sex hormones. Is LH and FSH a tropic hormone? Yes. So as long as we kind of follow this color scheme, it kind of tells us that in this area of thinking, so far we had a couple of tropic hormones here, didn't we? Tropic here, here, and for sure here. But growth hormone acts on our body tissues to cause tissue growth. Is that a tropic hormone? No. So that's why we have to remember the upper tier is all tropic, but the second tier that we have here some of them are tropic and others are not. Prolactin works on our mammary glands to release milk. Is that a tropic hormone? Milk is a protein material. It's not considered a hormone. It's excreted. So we have these two guys here not being our tropic hormones in this layer. The hypothalamus will have output and its little terminals hanging out in the neurohypophysis for the release of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone will directly act on the kidneys to cause water resorption, and oxytocin will directly act on the uterus and breast tissue to cause uterine contraction and milk letdown. So that is the hypothalamic control aspect. But also, what's interesting, the hypothalamus, you guys remember we have ANS control centers in the hypothalamus? And that's for rest, digest, and fight, flight. Well, the hypothalamus also has a direct line to our adrenal medulla. So the medulla is the inner aspect of our adrenal gland. And when we're in fight, flight mode, the hypothalamus tells the adrenal medulla immediately to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream to help prolong our fight-flight effect so that we can get away safely and be heroes and have heroic efforts. This chart here is really important for you to be able to reproduce on your own because it is a method for you to actually employ sometimes in learning when you actually can do a flow chart for these types of things. Now let's take a look at the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. The thyroid is an endocrine gland that overlies our trachea at the upper part of our trachea. It is inferior to our larynx or our voice box. And so it has two lobes, one on either side of our larynx, underneath where our voice box is, and has a little connection called an isthmus, which is a bridge. An isthmus is a bridge, so it bridges the two sides. It's actually considered the largest endocrine gland in our body, which is really kind of bizarre when you actually take a look at it, and it shows you how small glands have a major function over us. It is also one of the most vascular glands, endocrine gland of our body. It definitely has lots of blood flow to it. So inferior to your larynx, and if you were to be examined for the thyroid gland, the best way to examine anybody is from behind the individual, placing fingers on either side of the larynx and asking them to swallow, because that little bump that you actually feel is the thyroid gland being pulled up during swallowing. And so that's actually a very common method to actually feel or palpate the thyroid. What do you see when you look at this? What tells you that this is different from anything else you've ever looked at before? Pink circles, right? Pink circles surrounded by actually what are really flat cuboidal cells. Super flat cuboidal cells. So, when I see a histology picture of thyroid, I automatically know it's a thyroid gland whenever I see it, because nothing else has these things here that is basically colloid. This pink stuff is colloid. So when we take a look at it, we can say the structure is colloid-filled follicles. Follicle cells, PD, produce TH, thyroid hormone, stored in colloid in inactive form. Thyroid hormone is our major metabolic hormone. And requires iodine before its actual release into our bloodstream. Thyroid hormone equals T3 plus T4. T4. T4 is often called thyroxine. T3 means 3 iodines, and T4 means 4 iodines. So T3 and T4. So when thyroid hormone is circulating around in our bloodstream, it's circulating around in the form of T3 and T4. Thyroid hormone is fat soluble. So what do we know about our fat soluble hormones that we actually learned about earlier? It has a carrier protein, and it's called TBG, which stands for thyroid binding globulin. Bound and free. The free is the only active form. The bound is the inactive form, and thyroid binding globulin helps to prevent breakdown or degradation of thyroid hormone. When you are hypothyroid, you will take thyroxine orally. So whenever people take thyroid medication, they're actually taking thyroxine. And that's what they actually use to supplement themselves when they're hypothyroid. So we have follicle cells, which are immediately around the colloid, and each follicle has a simple cuboidal layer around it. So this is trying to draw around this guy here for that follicle. In the area in between follicles, there's these cells called parafollicular cells. So those are in this area for parafollicular cells. They produce and release calcitonin. What does calcitonin sound like it has some sort of impact with? Calcium. And calcitonin is designed to actually cause increased osteoblast activity. So it decreases blood calcium levels. Stimulates osteoblasts and inhibits osteoclast activity. So if your calcium level is high, these parafollicular cells will release calcitonin to cause a decrease in blood calcium levels. If your calcium level is low, these cells are not active, correct? Negative feedback affects them, and this is also a humoral mechanism of control. Parathyroid glands are on the posterior aspect of our thyroid. We usually have 4, can have more or less, and it's not always associated with the thyroid gland. Sometimes can be in other areas of our body associated with the central cavity. And they're very small, and if you took somebody's thyroid gland out of them for maybe a cancer, thyroid cancer reasons, you wouldn't be able to actually figure out where the parathyroid glands are because they're so small unless you actually injected them with a special dye or stain before you actually remove the gland. They're that small and difficult to actually make out. So let's put down very small. Full of chief cells, which depending upon your book will have all kinds of names. Chief cells, I've seen principal cells, and the best one is parathyroid cells. The reason they're called chief cells is when you take a look at the gland, that's almost all you see. This is the chief cell of the gland, and that's why they actually start off with that name, chief cells. The hormone that they produce is PTH, parathyroid hormone. PTH increases blood calcium levels. And it does so by increasing osteoclast activity. You guys have a little clinical case study that you're supposed to do, and this is kind of part of the history for that clinical case study about thyroid hormone and parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone will cause blood calcium levels to rise. In other words, it's too low, so it needs to rise. And it does so by stimulating osteoclasts, which break down the bone and release calcium into the bloodstream. And that's how it actually does that for you. Parathyroid levels, sustained parathyroid levels, sustained elevation of them can actually cause a condition known as osteoporosis. So release is due to low blood calcium. So calcitonin is released when calcium levels are high. And parathyroid hormone is released when calcium levels are low. Calcitonin will drop blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone will increase blood calcium levels. So they both have a very important role in calcium homeostasis. However, parathyroid hormone is the most important one for calcium homeostasis in adults. So parathyroid hormone is more important than calcitonin in our blood calcium homeostasis. Oxyphil cells are also in our parathyroid gland, function unclear. So they haven't figured out what those guys do yet. When you take a look and when you draw your histology for the parathyroid glands, you'll draw a bunch of nuclei, and they'll all be kind of packed close together. You guys see that up here in this picture, a bunch of nuclei all packed close together? And then to distinguish the oxyphil cell from the chief cells of the parathyroid gland, you want to make sure you draw a cell that doesn't have so many nuclei around it and has more of a defined or easily distinguished cytoplasm around it, correct? So when you take a look at that oxyphil cell, you should see a lot of cytoplasm around it, pushing the nuclei of the chief cells away from it. That's how you should draw your oxyphil cell, and that's how you should recognize an oxyphil cell in the parathyroid gland. Parathyroid glands are hard to identify all by themselves without a little bit of thyroid gland next to it. So you can see, if you see some colloids like up here, and then you see something that looks like the parathyroid gland down below, you know exactly what tissue you're dealing with, and can then decide if it's a chief cell or oxyphil cell that you're supposed to identify. Our adrenal glands are also called our suprarenal glands because they sit on top of our kidneys. And that's where they got suprarenal as part of their name. The kidneys are surrounded by a bunch of fat, and the adrenal glands sit in that fat. They're also encased in that fat that surround both of our kidneys, and they kind of look like the fat around our kidneys, but they're firm when you actually start mushing on the fat in a cadaveric specimen. So it's easy to actually, in the human cadaver for the students, to accidentally remove the adrenal glands when they're removing the fat around the kidneys, unless they know to look for it. So the adrenal glands look a lot like fatty tissue in a cadaveric specimen because they're just surrounded by fat, and that's the way they actually look. Histology-wise, let's take a look at the cartoon side of this first. I would recommend you draw your picture more like the cartoon and maybe a little less like the picture over here. And the reason for that is that the zona glomerulosa is right adjacent to the capsule, or the outer aspect of the adrenal gland. It's a very thin layer when you compare it to all the other layers, and the cells are in kind of like a circular type of pattern. And they call that zona glomerulosa, and so you would draw a bunch of these guys right next to one another. The layer below the zona glomerulosa, or deep to the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, I hope that you can actually appreciate that it's actually chains of cells. So fascicles are chains of cells. And that's how, no, that done. And that's how I'd recommend you draw that. Deep to the zona glomerulosa. And then the zona reticularis is supposed to be a lacy looking layer. And so you actually have no longer the fascicle aspect, but you have a reticulated or network look to those cells in those areas. And then finally, deep to that would be the adrenal medulla. It should have a lot of vascularity associated with that neural area for the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. But I think the cartoon is a better way to kind of figure out how to draw that for your own histology versus the guy on the right. Just makes the visual is easier to see, I think, than the histology picture. And your drawings are just drawings, right? They're kind of cartoons anyway. Let's take a look at what is produced by the zona glomerulosa fasciculata and then reticularis. Zona glomerulosa, the outermost aspect, produces a group of hormones called mineralocorticoids. So it actually will affect ion balance, mineral levels, mineralocorticoids. So ion balance. The main mineralocorticoid that it produces in the zona glomerulosa is aldosterone. When aldosterone is released, we will retain sodium and lose potassium. So for all the potassium we are excreting into the urine, we are actually taking in a sodium for that ionic exchange. Important, ACTH has little control here. This is a humoral situation. So humors. Is actually what a blood level of something is actually what controls the release of aldosterone. Zona fasciculata is going to be responsible for releasing a group of hormones called glucocorticoids. So mineralocorticoids are hormones and glucocorticoids are hormones. The glucocorticoids are actually metabolic hormones, and the most famous one from the zona fasciculata is cortisol. And some people have also heard of hydrocortisone, is another name for cortisol. S, not Z. Cortisol helps us to form new glucose from fats and proteins. That's what gluco stands for, glucocorticoid. We're going to make new glucose, and we'll use fats and proteins to help us do this. Interestingly, cortisol is also anti-inflammatory. Also anti-immune. When in excess. And so we can actually administer these types of hormones or pills or drugs related to this category of hormone in pill form, and it will cause an anti-inflammatory or anti-immune effect. And the most common one that most people will ingest is prednisone, right? You've heard of prednisone? People take prednisone, which is a family of the glucocorticoids, or a member of the glucocorticoid family, excuse me, a member of the glucocorticoid family. And it's in too high of a dose for its normal effects, and it's because it's being used for anti-inflammatory and anti-immune effects. So that's zona fasciculata. Zona reticularis is going to actually produce mainly gonadocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids are basically weak androgens. Androgens are male hormones. And it's produced in both sexes. It is converted to testosterone and estrogen when it hits the target tissues. So for women, these androgens will then be converted into estrogens, a little bit into testosterone, because actually both sexes have testosterone in them and both sexes have estrogen in them. It's just that men have so much more testosterone than women, and women have so much more estrogen than men. So we'll stop there. We'll finish up this chapter, and we'll finish up the adrenal gland and this chapter next time.